Kalila Brown Dean. You're listening to a Wheelhouse Special. 52 years ago this week, 600 peaceful protesters gathered in Selma, Alabama for what would become known as the Bloody Sunday March. Their goal was to draw attention to the importance of protecting the vote, not just for African Americans, but all Americans. The televised images of marchers being brutally beaten prompted the passage of the Voting Rights Act in the same year. The act struck down literacy tests, poll taxes, and other devices used to undermine American democracy. Today we discuss the history of voting rights and take a look at some contemporary challenges. In 2004, Swarthmore College political science professor Richard Vallely wrote his book, The Two Reconstructions, The Struggle for Black Enfranchisement. He was optimistic about the future of voting and the impending renewal of the Voting Rights Act. But then Shelby happened. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a monumental decision called Shelby v. Holder. It struck down the formula used to monitor jurisdictions with a documented history of discrimination. Chief Justice John Roberts reasoned that the formula was outdated because the country had changed. Within hours, states like Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama enacted new rules for voting, from photo ID requirements to shortening poll hours. Civil rights activists fear that these new policies will dampen minority participation. I asked Professor Vallely to provide some context around the ruling by highlighting the history of the Reconstruction eras.
One of the main things that drove the first Reconstruction was the position of the Republican Party after the Civil War, and it needed to build a southern wing for itself in order to remain nationally competitive. And as it happened, the on-the-ground, really quasi-revolutionary activity of people who had served in the Union Army and were there, people who were being mobilized by the Freedmen's Bureau, people who had just been emancipated, and all the informal social networks that existed, and a kind of underground of political thought and ferment. Those two things kind of connected in 1867, really, were coming on the sesquicentennial of this explosion of political participation and of enfranchisement, so that by the end of 1867, most African American adult males in the United States are enfranchised, and we still don't know really the full extent of it, but an enormous number of local offices are now being competed for by African American men, and so the first Reconstruction was this amazing expansion of democracy that really in my view, made the United States unique. I mean, it's the only post-emancipation society that quickly switched from being a post-emancipation society into being a fully functioning political democracy.
I noticed that when you were mentioning that first Reconstruction, there was a strong emphasis on men. So the 15th Amendment granted access for African American men, and women didn't come into the process until the 19th. So given how African American men came into democracy as voters and as office holders in key areas, why was that first Reconstruction so short-lived?
I mean, there's a debate about whether it was short-lived. In other words, W. Du Bois has this wonderful phrase in Black Reconstruction where he refers to 7 mystic years, and he's thinking about the redemption, basically the period from 1867 to 1874, when the so-called redemption starts, and the remaining Reconstruction governments in Mississippi and Louisiana and South Carolina face paramilitary challenge and then are finally toppled in the 1876 presidential election. But there is a post-Reconstruction story as well, in which there is a really remarkably high level of office holding and also of black adult male voter turnout that lasts into the 1890s in some places. And so from 1884 to 1896, there's basically a black-white populist Republican fusion government in the state of North Carolina, which is incredibly enfranchising and is overthrown by force only in 1898 with the Wilmington race riots that lasted for 3 days and led to essentially pogroms against middle-class business owners in the city of Wilmington, and were forced out, and newspapers are shut down, and it's basically a coup d'etat. So there's kind of democracy, and then there's this kind of uneasy period where, if you look at it real closely, there's still quite a lot of democracy, and it really isn't until the late 19th century that it becomes obvious that it's over, right, and that there has been a regime change. And that was when the debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington began about what do you do about this.
I want to pick up where you were talking, Rick, about this metaphor of war, this war of attrition. And we know that in every war there are casualties. So, in the context of this democratic battle about what parties were going to do, how they were going to maintain or extend their power, there were real casualties. And often those casualties were African Americans in the South who were the targets of extra legal measures. So you talk in your book about the role of the Klan in inciting fear. And so that even if people had, in theory, access to voting, that fear and threat really discouraged them from doing so. Can you paint that picture for our listeners of what those casualties of war, what did people encounter in trying to exercise that democratic right to vote or ability to vote?
The violence swept through the South in the form of race riots in 1874 and 1875 and 1876, where paramilitary organizations associated with white Democratic parties essentially kept people away from the polls, sometimes through massive shows of extra legal force. And in the congressional elections of 1878, very much a violent experience was visited in lots of places around the South on African American adult men. And so one of the things that Morgan Couser, the historian of voting rights at Caltech, has pointed out is that while the violence was terrible, and we still don't actually have an accurate count of the casualties, and while the federal government was often unable to quell the violence, it was a little bit like El Salvador during the Civil War. No matter how much violence there was, as long as people had hope, they would come back and fight another day and essentially experience casualties. So in the end, what caused disenfranchisement was changes in the rules and the creation of literacy tests, the creation of poll taxes or the use of poll taxes in such a way so that between personal registration, the Australian ballot, literacy tests, and poll taxes, it became impossible for an African adult male to actually exercise the right to vote. And from the perspective of the white supremacists who created the disenfranchising system, that was the beauty of it. They no longer needed violence. They had put together a system of interlocking rules and institutions such that no one person could actually pay at the margin the cost of trying to satisfy all the legal requirements. And then it was at that point that that Republicans in the North simply said, forget it, we can do without the South, and we're not going to intervene anymore.
So what I think is important as well is that many of those strategies and tactics that targeted African Americans in the South also disenfranchised a number of whites living in particular counties or those from immigrant backgrounds. So when you mention that institutional effectiveness of thinking of casualties in a very different way, that struggle or emphasis on Black enfranchisement was also about a larger American story of disenfranchising people who should have been able to vote.
Yeah, and one of the things that happens is that when you get disenfranchisement kicking in, it's biracial disenfranchisement. The rules changes were dreamed up in part to quell Black-white electoral alliances in third parties or fusion alliances between Republican parties and populist white farmers formations who didn't really care about racial difference. What they cared about was doing something about the political economy. They weren't by any means tolerant. That is to say, the colored farmers alliances were a segregated organization. But in terms of agreeing on a free ballot and a fair count, the white farmers organizations and parties and the black Republican parties, those made these coalitions, and so the disenfranchisement did disenfranchise also white farmers and essentially the white lower class. So it was a kind of oligarchy that was an authoritarian oligarchy that was erected in this new institutional environment.
So let's talk about those coalitions, because whether we were talking about those episodic moments of violence, the more institutionalized ways of discouraging people from voting or limiting their access, we do get to a point in 1965 where Lyndon Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act that struck down many of those measures. How key are coalitions to enacting that kind of change, whether we're talking about at the grassroots level within legislative institutions like Congress or in the courts? Can we see that kind of massive change in voting and enfranchisement without those coalitions?
What the Voting Rights Act had behind it was a hope that there would be a new Democratic Party in the South. And in the end, the hope turned out to be undercut, but it didn't take. It took a long time for it to be undercut. And the hope was that, and Martin Luther King would explain this when he was talking to LBJ on the phone. He would say, "Look, if we can create this Voting Rights Act, then we can create a liberal black-white coalition among voters, and we can create liberal Democratic parties." This was always the dream of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party in the North, was that they could create a counterpart in the South that would have the same kind of biracial coalition at the base that liberal Democratic parties had in northern cities, even though those weren't particularly, Chicago was not exactly an admirable kind of Democratic biracial coalition, and black politicians in Chicago had to fight real hard and into the 1980s in order to find their rightful place inside the Chicago Democratic Party. But the vision was that we can create biracial coalitions on the basis of class and on the basis of shared policy interests, and these can be liberal coalitions, and we can build them in the South. And for a while, that worked. I mean, you actually had that kind of politics as late as the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And now, the thing about the South that's so weird is, from the long historical perspective, is that the two-party politics seems to be an unstable prospect for Southern party politics.
So I want you to think about where we are now as a country in 2017. We have a new president. Given that historical context that you are so well versed with, do you think that we're facing a time where that second Reconstruction may be weakened or undermined? Or are the protections that were put into place by that long journey toward enfranchisement, are they secure for voters moving forward?
Clearly what Sessions has in mind is non-enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. And at least people are expecting that, given his record. He may surprise us, and I hope he does. But between Sessions' history and the kind of flirting with bigotry that is open, and the fact that there is this talk of having a national investigation into vote fraud, which is, vote fraud historically has been the stalking horse for disenfranchisement and for leading attacks on rights. One question that I've been thinking about is there any more that the people who are pushing voter ID participation is at a high point? Minority electoral participation among African Americans and among Latinos is as robust and as strong as it's ever been, which is, of course, partly why you wonder why all of a sudden there's this discussion of massive vote fraud. The kind of deep, mysterious, paranoid way of looking at this, which I have to wrestle with all the time, Rick, calm down, walk yourself back from the ledge. It's not as bad as it looks. Can they actually do any more damage that's already been done since Shelby? Because one of the things that happened both before and after Shelby was that voter ID swept around the country, and so it's sort of like all of the voter suppression has already been taken, as it were. Are there new ways to suppress? And even if there is a vote fraud investigation, it's just going to blow up on them if it's a serious investigation. Right. There is no in-person voter fraud. It doesn't exist. And so if they run a reasonably honest commission or investigation, they're going to have to conclude, just as the Bush administration, which tried to do this also, although in a much less flamboyant way, they're just going to have to conclude that it doesn't exist. And so they're just going to have to eat the lie. But the thing that's really surprising is, we're over 200 years old as an electoral democracy, and we're still fighting over the right to vote.
So I think that's a great place to end. We're still fighting over the right to vote at this point in our country's history. Rick Vallely is professor of political science at Swarthmore College, and he's the author of the two reconstructions, The Struggle for Black Enfranchisement. Thanks for joining us.
Such a pleasure, and I really enjoyed talking with you, Kalila.
Coming up, we'll hear how one woman in Alabama was targeted for helping minorities vote in the 1970s and its relevance in 2017. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we're talking about voting rights. In the last segment, we mentioned Shelby and Selma as major centers in the struggle for voting rights. Now we fast forward to the late 70s and shift our gaze to Pickens County, Alabama. An Ebony magazine article from 1982 called Pickens, the County Where the Old South Refuses to Die. A decade and a half after the Voting Rights Act was enacted, Pickens County was still dealing with issues of racism and segregation. This prompted Black citizens to pursue their own means of inclusion. One woman on the front lines of that fight was Maggie Bozeman, an outspoken African-American teacher. Bozeman was president of the local NAACP. She made it her mission to get Blacks registered to vote and to drive them to the polls, a commitment that ironically would lead to her losing the right to vote forever. She died in 2004. But her daughter, Punta DeLeste, has her own mission, telling her family's story and continuing the fight for civil rights. She joined us to talk about her mother. Punta DeLeste Bozeman, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I have to ask, how does a little girl in Alabama get such a big name?
Well, it's a long story, but I will condense it. Both my parents were educators, and particularly my dad. He was a history teacher during my mom's pregnancy. Well, all of the presidents meet in a certain location during my birth month, which is December. Just so happens they were going to meet at this particular place in Uruguay, Punta del Este. So my dad, being the historian and with a sense of humor, I guess, goes to my mother, whose name is Maggie. Maggie, hey, let's name her Punta del Este. And my mother was like, okay, Clarence. Both my parents have common names. Mm-hmm. So Maggie and Clarence, and then here comes Punta del Este.
So you are the child of two educators who clearly were very aware of what was going on in the world at the time to name you after this important location. But your mom chose to focus on voting rights and of promoting voting rights to African Americans living in your area. Why did she choose to focus on access to voting?
My mother was an activist all of her life from the time that I remember. My parents divorced when I was young, so it was just my mother and I. So I remember vividly her involvement. It began locally, then it expanded statewide. Living in a rural area in Alabama, Pickens County, we are West Alabama, primarily what is known as the Black Belt. The Bible Belt, we are 45 minutes from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, the home of national champions, by the way, Roll Tide. But my mom's involvement, she saw a lack of Black elected officials. She saw a need of helping people. In order that to happen, she had to start registering, get involved. She then formed the Pickens County Voters League. The main purpose of that organization was to go door to door, grassroots organization, and register people to vote.
Now, a lot of people, when they think about the struggle for voting rights, particularly in the South, in a place like Alabama, they assume that that struggle ended with the Bloody Sunday March in Selma, or that it culminated with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And yet, even in 1979, your mother still faced a lot of backlash and struggle for her involvement in this area. Share with our listeners what was happening with your mother, Maggie Bozeman, in 1979.
In 1979, I was 16, 17 years old at the time, and by trade, my mother was a school teacher. That was her everyday 9 to 5. One day, when I came home from school, she was not at home. No one, and me being an only child, it wasn't as if my sisters came and said, "Hey, mom's not here," or my brother, "Hey, there's no mom." But that particular day, I thought maybe she was at a meeting like she always did, go to meetings after work. It didn't bother me. Time went on. The entire day she didn't come home. My aunt finally came to tell me that my mother is not coming home today. Sheriff Louis Coleman at the time came to my mother's school while she was teaching and arrested her in front of her second grade students. Mind you, we're talking about a rural elementary school. The sheriff comes into the school, goes to the principal. "We need to speak with Maggie Bozeman." My mother comes out. He immediately pulls the handcuffs out on her and takes her in the back of the sheriff's car. "We are charging you with voter fraud." They took her down, booked her, held her overnight. My mother had no idea what was going to happen. She was literally ambushed, politically ambushed at that moment. That changed her life forever. Throughout all the years, or throughout all of my formative years, everything that she had fought for, everything she believed in, right now was culminating at this point. She was released. She came back home. But the funny thing about it, when she came back home, she never discussed it with me. She didn't discuss where she had been. She didn't, here's a lady. If you knew my mother, she had a sense of humor. She was absolutely she was very adamant about her cause. So when she returned home, she just walked in the house and like, "Hey, how you doing? How was school today?" I'm like, "Huh? You're not going to discuss anything with me about it," which she did not. So me being a mischievous little kid, well, teenager, I'm sitting in the room while she's on the phone talking to all of these people. She's talking to Walter Fauntroy from, at the time, he was representative from the District of Columbia. She's on the phone talking to Joseph Lowry, who was at the time president of the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She was talking to the Legal Defense Fund in New York. I'm sitting there just listening. Yes, I was nosy because she wasn't discussing. I wanted to know what was going on.
So let's take a step back. What was the reason that they gave for arresting your mother? What was the claim about voter fraud in your mother's case?
There were 3 charges. It was not only my mother. It was her, what I used to call her Thelma and Louise, her peanut butter and jelly, her Lucy and Ethel, Mrs. Julia Wilder. They were charged with voter fraud. They were charged. The second count was voting more than once, and the third is voting absentee ballot more than once. Now, legally, you can assist a person to vote. For example, if I cannot read or write, if I am illiterate, I can go to Miss John right at the door. "Excuse me, Miss John, can you help me fill out this ballot? Can you help me vote? You just read it to me, and I'll tell you who I can vote for." That's legal. They said that my mother did the exact same thing, and it wasn't legal. So therefore, she voted more than once by assisting other people.
Was this common during that time to arrest people on these allegations of voter fraud, or do you feel like your mother and her best friend were perhaps targeted?
Oh, they were definitely targeted. My mother was very outspoken, very outspoken. I mean, in our community during that time, my mother refused. I remember now, my town, Aliceville, Alabama, literally 3 schools, 1 post office, 2 funeral homes. is that rural type of environment that I was born and raised in. And we have two grocery stores, still do to this day. The Piggly Wiggly, yes, we do have a Piggly Wiggly, and they do exist. The Piggly Wiggly would not hire black cashiers, but yet and still they wanted blacks to patronize them. Well, my mother refused to go there until you hire a black cashier. She refused to go into that store. My mother finally got a black cashier hired, and she went in. This was in the early 70s, 71, 72. My mother has always been vocal in that community. Not only was she a respected teacher, but she also was a respected civil rights activist in our community. I remember, people would come to our house in the middle of the night. Miss Bozeman, my son just got arrested. Louis Coleman just came to pick him up. What can we do? My mother was that go-to girl, if you will, in the community. So the white infrastructure during that time noticed her. Like, wait a minute, she's the one that people are going to. She's the one that's trying to make sure that everybody has equality in this small rural area. Oh, we've got to stop her.
What was the outcome of your mother's case and of her arrest?
Well, she was convicted by an all-white jury. She was sentenced to 4 years, and Miss Julia Wilder was sentenced to the max of 5. She was sentenced, and she went to Julia Tutwiler Women's Prison in the state of Alabama. So she literally went to the only women's prison in the state of Alabama. And the governor pardoned them on a work release program. So they only remained there for 15 days. But during that time, I was in high school, a senior in high school. So I never saw my mother for those 15 days. Once Governor James released her on a work release program, she then was released under Lucius Amerson, the sheriff of Macon County, where Tuskegee is, by the way, under his custody. She was not allowed. There were 2 provisions. Okay, yeah, we'll let you out of prison, ladies, but you're going to have to go to Macon County, and you cannot return back to Pickens County, your home, nor will you have your right to vote. So my mother, both of them lost their right to vote.
And so they lost that ability to vote for the rest of their life.
Correct. That is absolutely correct.
So we often hear about people like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, or we know the story of John Lewis, and most people know about Rosa Parks. But your mother was essentially one of those unsung heroes in the civil rights struggle. What is it that you want people to know and remember about Maggie Bozeman?
First, there's several things. The one thing is I want people to know that she had perseverance. Even to know that in the late 70s and early 80s, when all of this happened, this didn't happen in the 50s or the 60s. This happened in an era where blacks had an opportunity to march forward. I want people to know and understand that she persevered. She was not going to take no for an answer, no matter what. I used to accompany my mom to meetings. I remember going, I'll have so many stories, but one in particular. My mother was a guest speaker someplace in Birmingham, and we went to check in the hotel, and they lost her reservation. So there's no way, we had no place to stay. So she gets to the counter, and she begins to check in, and the gentleman behind said, well, ma'am, we no longer have your reservation, therefore that we're all booked out, blah, blah, blah. My mother said, well, I need to speak to your manager. The manager's not here. My mother told the gentleman, call corporate. When she told that man to call corporate, my mother turned and looked at me. She said, always go to the top. Always go to the top. And there's some things that you remember for the rest of your life. That is the one thing about my mother. She was very direct, and she did not back down. She never backed down.
So you're reminding us about that need to remember the past, but to also realize how current that past history is. So you had a mother who was active in the struggle for voting rights and civil rights in the U.S., And yet your father also had some close proximity and involvement with the civil rights struggle. Tell us a little about your dad's involvement.
Yes, yes, my dear dad who named me Clarence Bozeman. Uh, he's a very interesting man, by the way. My dad is or was the driver for Dr. Martin Luther King. My father, like I stated earlier, both my parents, they met at Alabama State University in Montgomery, Alabama. They were both students there. So my father was a student, and one of his professors came to him while he was in summer school and said, "There's a minister, a young minister that has just moved into town, and he needs a driver to take him back and take his family back and forth to church. Would you be interested in the job?" And my dad, being a young college kid, of course, hey, money, yeah, I'll do it. He did it. He gets dressed up, goes for the interview, knocks on the door, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. answers the door. At the time, of course, my dad had no clue who he was just there for the job and for the money to take my mom out, which I found out later. But anyway, he was his driver for years. And I did not find this out until after I was in college. My dad decides to make a surprise visit to me at Howard University where I attended. And he takes me to dinner and, he tells me everything about, his life and, you know, he says, oh, by the way, I was a driver for Martin Luther King. Your mom never told you? No. She never did. And she never did tell me. She not one time in the 18 years that I lived under my mother's roof that she told me, hey, your dad was a driver for Martin Luther King. I never knew until I was a freshman in college.
So it's
So,
clear, though, that your parents really instilled in you this sense of humility and this sense of concern for community. Given all that's going on in our country right now, some of our listeners may be in Connecticut and say, oh, that was the past. That wasn't a problem for Alabama. How does that really connect to what's happening here or in other parts of the country? What would you say to people who see this as a Southern problem and not an American problem?
there are 50 states in the Union. Every state is affected by my mom's ordeal. Every state has a representation locally, statewide, and nationally. Every senator, every congressperson that is elected got there by voting. That's the only way. Voting is the most important tool that anybody can have. It has power. It can make or break you. It is the most important tool that we as American citizens have.
How do you continue that journey that your parents took? Are you involved in these same issues in Alabama or in other areas as well?
Well, my involvement is a little bit differently than my mom. And it's funny. My mother passed in 2004, and I moved back to Alabama to raise my son. And during the time, my mother passed in August of 2004. The latter part of August, the beginning of September, they were having a local election. So a lot of people didn't know my mother had passed, so they were coming to the house, ringing the bell, knocking on the doors, and, excuse me, is your mom here? Can she give me a ride to the polls? Because that's what she did as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, no, I'm sorry, my mom is no longer here. Well, can you take me to the polls? And wait a minute, hold on, that's my mom thing. I can't wait. Hold on. So what I started doing, I started getting involved with kids in the community in Pickens County, actively involved. I sponsored back-to-school jamborees. The running joke in my household was, I love everybody kids but my own. That's my involvement. I start with the youth for two reasons. Number one, I'm a mother myself, like I said. So my son, I have to instill in them what needs to be done. Get involved in your community. Start with your friends. I used to encourage my son, hey, when they turn 18, hey, you're going to take them to register to vote. And they did. I used to take them with me going door to door. Hey, we got to get people registered to vote. So I started with kids there, and I'm still involved with kids. I like them. They're all right with me.
Punta del Este Bozeman, thank you so much for sharing your family's story and for continuing that work. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so kindly for having me. I truly enjoyed it. It's a pleasure.
Coming up, a look at the current landscape for voting rights. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. Stay with us. Today we're talking voting rights. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. Late last month, the Trump administration rescinded an Obama-era challenge to a 2011 Texas voter ID law. Texas is among the toughest states in the nation when it comes to voter restrictions. How might that decision set the tone for what we can expect in the next 4 years? John Nichols joins us now. He's National Affairs Correspondent at The Nation. Thanks for being here.
It's an honor to be with you.
So most Americans really only think about voting during elections, so every 4 years or perhaps every 2 years. But over the last month, we've been hearing a lot about voting rights, and in particular, allegations of voting fraud. What should we expect on the horizon under the Trump administration?
You know, voting is a great struggle of American history. We were founded as a country with great aspirations, but we didn't let many people be a part of defining who we were. Only a small portion of Americans were allowed to vote. But over a very long time, with wars and marches and struggles and tremendous battles, we got to a point where we had expanded the electorate to include the vast majority of Americans. And that was in the 1970s. Now we have seen, especially in recent years, an awful lot of efforts to, if not constrict the electorate, at the very least make it harder to vote. And there are a couple of things that are important to understand. America has very low voter turnout. We don't have enough people voting. Our problem is that as compared to many countries we'd want to compare ourselves with, our turnout's not sufficient. And in an increasing number of states, as the Brennan Center and others have detailed, barriers have been erected. It's been made harder to vote. We have a lot of things we ought to be doing to make it easier. Universal registration, patterns of voting that allow people to cast ballots, say, in libraries and public buildings before an election as well as on election day. There's all sorts of things you can do to make it very easy to vote. Instead, in the Trump administration, we have an attorney general, Jeff Sessions, who has a long history of being on the other side of voting rights fights, being on the side of constricting and restricting. And interestingly enough, we have other people coming in, like the proposed labor secretary, who also has a history of being involved in some messy conflicts as regards voting rights. And at the core of it, there is a sense, and I'll be very blunt about it. I don't like saying this about anybody, but the simple reality is it doesn't look like President Trump has an understanding of or respect for what the real challenges are as regards voting rights. Instead, he makes wild claims that are unsubstantiated about massive amounts of illegal voting. And so I'm very concerned about this administration, and I'm concerned that its authority and its power will weigh in on the side of increasing restrictions on voting rights rather than an expansion, which is what we need.
Well, you wrote a piece about Alexander Acosta, who is the proposed labor secretary, and you talked about his history of attacking voting rights. What was his role during the Bush administration in this domain?
Mr. Acosta is an incredibly accomplished man, a very, very smart man, who has held a lot of key roles over the years. He was on the National Labor Relations Board, and then he was an assistant attorney general with a very powerful responsibility for a lot of civil rights enforcement. Under that, you had voting rights concerns. In 2004, we had a very messy situation in the United States where after the incredibly close 2000 election, and with polls showing the 2004 election would also be close between George Bush and John Kerry, in a number of states, you had Republican Party folks step up and say that they wanted to have poll watchers, folks at the polls, with lists of folks, frankly seeking to identify and disqualify voters. It's an old tactic, but one which is incredibly problematic because, A, the people that you're trying to disqualify, you may not have identified right, and B, just the intimidation factor was a real concern. So civil rights activists, especially in Ohio, which was the most closely contested state, went into court and they said, look, this is wrong. This is bad law. It's lingering law from the distant past that allowed for this kind of basically vote challenging is what it's called. And they really tried to push back on it. As the case was coming to a head, amazingly enough, Mr. Acosta weighed in as, in many ways, one of the top civil rights officials in the United States, saying, oh, this is no problem. This doesn't violate the Voting Rights Act. This really doesn't bother us, and it's not something that should be, that the courts should be too worried about. And he didn't do so with a particular amount of standing. He didn't do so because he was party to the case. He literally just kind of waded in with this pronouncement. It was an incredibly controversial act at the time, well reported on. And then in the aftermath of it, you had a tremendous fallout within the sections of the Department of Justice that dealt with voting rights and voting issues. A lot of people stepping down. And frankly, as time went on, when investigations were done and reviews, these folks said, this was, they objected. They said that what was going on here was just not right. And if you look back in the 2000s on the reports on the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division, especially during the time that Mr. Acosta was there, they're quite damning. And they led to a lot of questions from Congress and other folks. Unfortunately, as with so many things in the United States, history goes on and we tend to forget about a lot. I think the coverage of the Acosta nomination, in my view, has been, pretty limp. By and large, he's viewed as an improvement on his predecessor, and in many ways he may be. But on some of these core civil rights, voting rights issues, there are questions that ought to be addressed, and one hopes that they will be raised when his hearings, and Mr. Acosta's hearings, take place before the proper Senate committee.
So you mentioned having Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, Acosta having this background in attacking voting rights or intimidation, promoting intimidation.
At the very least, I think if we're generous to him, to say rather than promoting it, at the very least, casting not objecting in the way that you would hope that the federal government would object.
And promoting it as a legitimate way of controlling access. Given all of that, how much damage can this administration really do to voting rights in the next 4 years? All of his claims of voter fraud, the potential for an investigation. Should Americans be concerned?
Absolutely. Profoundly concerned. Look, 30 years ago, Democrats and Republicans determined that Jeff Sessions should not be a federal judge because of his approach to people who have been working on issues of voting rights. That history is lost, or at least was reversed. He's now the Attorney General. He's in a much more powerful position with regards to those issues. Again, Mr. Acosta was the subject of damning complaints and reports back not 30 years ago, but a decade ago as regards voting rights. So you have people there whose records are not good. And then you have a president who, both on his own and with those who surround him, has sent terrible signals, literally dealt in what can, without any question, be referred to as fake news, as false statements about this notion of illegal voting, illicit voting, people who are not citizens voting, all sorts of claims that are simply not substantiated. And the fear is that as this notion is pushed out at the federal level and also at the state level, because in many states you have allies of Mr. Trump, or at least members of the same political party in control of state houses, that you will see a further constriction, a further restriction of voting rights in the United States. If we see a expansion of these restrictions, of these unneeded limits on the ease of voting, combined with a continual sort of false narrative about illegal voting. And I might add, with many of the other interventions that people don't associate with voting, the weakening of trade unions, which historically have been vehicles that do mobilize people to go to the polls, threats to immigrants, threats to particular religious communities that, again, may cause an intimidation factor, just in dealing with official interactions, official acts, and then voting being one of them. You just end up in a situation where the wrong signal is being sent.
People will listen to this, and the question that they will ask is, what do we do about this? So what can people listening and concerned about these issues and perhaps made more aware of them, what can people actually do about this?
There are groups, many of which people know, that are working on these issues every day. They can learn more. Don't just listen to me. Read lots. Read what the Brennan Center and what Demos and other groups are saying about these issues. The NAACP and others have really stepped up. You can take a look at what's happening in Oregon, where they have a governor who really is a champion of voting rights, and they're expanding access. They're making it easier to register and to vote. Get yourself informed. Find a group that you want to be active with. And also, one thing that's very, very important, I think that it's important to not let this issue be a partisan issue. If you're concerned about this, reach out to people across party lines. Remind our Republican friends that they were the party of Lincoln, the party that cast disproportional number of votes back in the 60s in favor of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Remind our libertarian friends and our green friends that these are, that there's a lot of barriers to third parties that need to be broken down. We need to open up our process, and remind our Democratic friends that this isn't just about winning elections. This is about making sure that your supporters or potential supporters are enfranchised. And the last thing I would suggest is keep track of what Congressman Keith Ellison and Congressman Mark Pocan are doing. They have introduced a constitutional amendment to guarantee the right to vote and the right to have your vote counted. Obviously, constitutional amendments are always uphill efforts, but that initiative, I think, really highlights the challenges we face and the opportunities we have. Countries like Belgium sometimes get to a 90% voter turnout. We strive to get to 55 and anywhere near 60. So we ought to, as citizens, be learning about how to expand our electorate, get much higher turnout, because at the end of the day, these words like turnout and electorate, they have some meaning. But what we really need to understand is that high turnout elections, where everybody's a part of things, that's where we really get democracy. And democracy is still the goal, I think, that people across party lines and ideologies strive for.
Principled, not partisan. John Nichols is the National Affairs Correspondent at The Nation. Thanks so much for joining us.
This has been a great pleasure to talk to you.
The Wheelhouse is produced by Katie Tolarski. Thanks to Kyan Wolf, Robin Doyon-Aiken, and John Denkusky. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean.